Dear listeners of our stories, we are glad to welcome you to a new episode. Today we invite you not just to hear a story, but to step inside one of the most difficult periods of the 20th century, a time that changed the lives of millions and left a permanent mark on history. Today's episode is about the Great Depression of the 1930s. This is not a story taken from a movie, and not a work of fiction. Everything you are about to hear is based on real facts, historical documents, newspaper reports, and first-hand accounts of people who lived through that time. We will talk about how people lost their jobs and their homes, how they survived without food and heat, why movie theaters became places to sleep, and what the word survival truly meant for ordinary people. This story is not about numbers in economic reports. It is about everyday life, about the silence of empty streets, about long lines for soup, and about people who kept going despite everything. Everyday life during the Great Depression, 1930s. The Great Depression was not just an economic crisis. For millions of people, it became a slow collapse of normal life, stretching over several years. Unlike wars or natural disasters, the Depression had no single dramatic beginning. It crept in gradually. When the stock market crashed in 1929, most Americans did not own stocks. But within months, they lost their jobs, their homes, and their sense of security about the future. Banks that disappeared overnight. Between 1930 and 1933, more than 9,000 banks in the United States closed. Depositors lost all their savings. There was no deposit insurance. People discovered this by standing in front of locked doors early in the morning. Newspapers described scenes of despair, silent crowds, handwritten notices on doors, guards who could offer no help. Unemployment as a new reality. By 1933, 1 out of every 4 Americans was unemployed. In some industrial cities, it was 1 out of 2. Factories stood idle, stores closed, and streets grew quiet. People searched for work every day, for months, sometimes for years. There was almost no government assistance. Help came mainly from churches and charitable organizations. Loss of housing and Hoovervilles. People lost their homes on a massive scale. Across the country, makeshift settlements known as Hoovervilles appeared, built from crates, cardboard, and scrap metal. There was no heating, no sanitation, no medical care. In winter, people froze. In summer, they fell ill. Entire neighborhoods of poverty existed next to wealthy cities. Lines for free food became a common sight. In New York City alone, tens of thousands of servings of soup were distributed every day. The typical diet for many families consisted of bread, beans, and potatoes. Meat disappeared from meals for months at a time. Children fainted from hunger. Doctors reported widespread malnutrition and anemia. Movie theaters as places to live. One of the most striking and well-documented realities of the Great Depression was that movie theaters became shelters and temporary homes. A ticket cost 5 to 10 cents. Inside, however, it was warm, well-lit, and safe. Bought a single ticket and stayed inside all day, sometimes until closing time. They slept in the seats, warmed themselves, or simply sat in silence. Some theater owners looked the other way. For thousands of people, this was the only place where they could survive the night. Films of the 1930s showed luxury, music, and happy faces. They offered escape, brief, but essential. Historians note that despite widespread poverty, movie theaters remained crowded. People needed, even for a few hours, to forget the reality outside. Farmers and the Dust Bowl. Drought and poor land management turned farmland into dust. Massive dust storms followed. Families lost their farms and were forced onto the road. More than 2.5 million people became internal migrants within their own country. Children of the Depression. Children worked from an early age. They left school. They helped their families survive. Later in life, many of them recalled that the fear of poverty never left them. The psychological impact. Rates of suicide, alcoholism, and depression rose sharply. Many people simply disappeared, becoming wanderers without records or identities. A slow recovery. With the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt, government programs began to appear. They did not solve everything immediately, but they gave people work, and, most importantly, hope. The legacy of that time. The Great Depression became a lesson for an entire generation. It showed how fragile stability can be. It changed how people viewed money, work, and the future. Everyday life during the Great Depression, 1930s. The Great Depression was not simply an economic crisis. For millions of people, it became a slow destruction of everyday life, lasting for years. Unlike wars or natural disasters, the Depression had no single dramatic beginning. It arrived gradually, taking away jobs, homes, food, and any sense of the future. By the time ordinary people felt its full impact, there was already little they could do to stop it. Banks that closed overnight. Between 1930 and 1933, more than 9,000 banks in the United States shut down. For ordinary citizens, this meant the immediate loss of all savings. There was no deposit insurance. Money did not disappear physically, it disappeared legally. People arrived at banks in the morning only to find the doors locked. Sometimes a handwritten notice was posted. Sometimes there was nothing at all. Crowds gathered anyway, hoping the doors might reopen. Newspapers of the time described employment as a way of life. By 1933, 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed. In industrial cities such as Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago, unemployment was far higher. Entire factories shut down or operated only a few days a month. People searched for work every day. They walked miles, checked bulletin boards, asked strangers. They returned home empty-handed, not once, but for months or even years. There was almost no government assistance. If a person had no relatives or charity to rely on, they were left with nothing. Loss of housing and Hoovervilles. As unemployment spread, people lost their homes. Rent could not be paid. Mortgages could not be met. Evictions became routine. Across the country, makeshift settlements known as Hoovervilles appeared. They were built on vacant land, near railroad tracks, along rivers and city outskirts. Homes were made from wooden crates, scrap metal, cardboard, old fabric. There was no heating, no sanitation, and no medical care. In winter, people froze. In summer, disease spread quickly. Tuberculosis, dysentery, and skin infections were common. Lines for food and chronic hunger. Soup kitchens became a permanent feature of city life. In major cities, lines stretched for blocks. People stood quietly, sometimes for hours, waiting for a bowl of soup and a piece of bread. A typical diet for many families consisted of bread, beans, potatoes, occasionally vegetables. Meat was rare. Some children did not eat it for months or even years. School reports documented fainting from hunger, stunted growth, widespread malnutrition. Movie theaters as shelter and temporary homes. One of the lesser-known but well-documented realities of the Great Depression was the use of movie theaters as places to sleep and survive. Movies were cheap. A ticket often cost 5 to 10 cents. At the same time, movie theaters offered things most people no longer had. Warmth, light, padded seats, safety from the streets. For the homeless and extremely poor, movie theaters became a form of shelter. How it worked in practice. People bought a single ticket and stayed inside for hours, moving from one screening to the next. Some stayed all day. Others slept through most of the films. Eyewitness accounts describe people arriving with small bundles of belongings, removing shoes to stay warm, trying to look respectable so they would not be thrown out. Some theater owners tolerated this quietly. They understood that people had nowhere else to go. Others forced people out or called the police. During winter, movie theaters were often the only warm place available to the homeless. Movies as psychological escape. Beyond physical shelter, movies served an important psychological purpose. Films of the 1930s showed elegant homes, well-dressed actors, music, romance, and happy endings. For a few hours, people could forget unemployment, hunger, and fear. Historians note that movie attendance remained high throughout the Depression precisely because escape was essential to survival. Farmers in the Dust Bowl. In rural areas, conditions were often worse. Economic collapse combined with environmental disaster. Years of drought and aggressive farming practices turned fertile land into dust. Massive dust storms darkened the sky. Dust entered homes, lungs, food, and water. Farmers lost their land, crops, and livestock. More than 2.5 million people were forced to leave their homes, becoming migrants within their own country. Many traveled west to California, where they lived in camps and worked for extremely low wages, sometimes only a few cents an hour. Children of the Depression. Children worked from a very young age. They sold newspapers, collected scrap metal, shined shoes, or worked in the fields. Many left school to help their families survive. Decades later, interviews show that people who grew up during the Depression never lost their fear of poverty, even if they later became successful. Psychological consequences. One of the most devastating effects of the Great Depression was psychological. Men who believed their worth depended on providing for their families often fell into despair. There was a sharp rise in suicide rates, alcoholism, depression. Many people simply disappeared. They left towns, changed names, traveled without documents, and lived as wanderers. A slow path forward. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt became president. His New Deal programs did not end the Depression immediately, but they changed daily life. For the first time in years, people had government jobs, steady of small incomes, a sense that the future might exist again. Conclusion. The Great Depression was not a single story. It was millions of quiet personal tragedies. It was nights spent in movie theaters, endless lines for soup, children growing up too fast, and people learning how to survive without certainty. It was a time when even a movie theater could become a home, and survival itself became an act of endurance. Those who lived through the 1930s remembered forever empty shelves, nights spent in movie theaters, lines for soup, and fear of the next day, but they also remembered the human ability to endure. Farewell. Thank you for being with us in this episode. Thank you for listening to our stories and helping preserve the memory of the past. History is not only about dates and events, it is about the lives of ordinary people who once found themselves inside a great crisis. Until the next episode, take care, and see you soon.